So in the past when I've looked at John, it's often been in the context of really looking at Jesus. And so although I've done a lot of material on him, it's all spread all over the place. It was only in trying to pull together the things, the notes I've got and the PowerPoint slides from different presentations that it really fell out to me how significant John the Baptist ministry was. I had a slide in one of the things I did, one of the Living the Life videos where I introduced John, where I talk about how John kind of frames Jesus's life, but it came out much more clearly how he plays a really significant role. If we go, I can't. Oh, hang on, I can turn myself off. Let me just turn myself off. How do I? Oh, obviously, John the Baptist is there, and he is the first human being to respond by revelation to the presence of Jesus when he leaps in the womb. So he's the first, if you like, prophetic witness of the incarnation. As we're going to look at next week, we're going to look at Jesus, the beginning of John's ministry, and most significantly the baptism of Jesus. The baptism of Jesus reveals the Trinity like no other event in Scripture. The Trinity theologically can be traced right the way from Genesis 1, particularly Psalm 33, Proverbs 8, various passages that are very Trinitarian. And in the intertestamental periods, as the rabbis had to now deal with a disparate people who weren't so enculturated naturally in the stories of Judaism, and they started to try and retell it in its significance, a kind of proto-Trinitarian theology starts to emerge in the intertestamental period, which is going to play a role. Again, I think we're seeing it next week because it's a bit more introduction week this week. in shaping an idea of that eventually in Christianity becomes the Trinity. So the baptism really expresses the Trinity. You kind of see it obviously. There's a voice from heaven, my son, so declaring himself as Father, Son, and the Spirit coming down, the Holy Spirit. You see, so we see all of those acted out, and John becomes a witness to that. He bears testimony to it, for instance. So he's there at the incarnation. He manages an event which expresses the Trinity like no other event in the Bible, and of course his key prophecy is of Pentecost. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire. Which actually Jesus quotes just as he ascends, just as Jesus is about to ascend. He says, "Go and wait, because as John told you, you've got to wait for the Holy Spirit and fire." Well, he doesn't use the word fire there. He just said, "Wait for the Holy Spirit." So John's ministry is actually prophetically if you look at the character of Jesus, there are these big moments that John is the major prophet of. But unlike, say, Isaiah or Jeremiah, he doesn't get his own book. So we know it in the context of the Gospels, and in which case he's often sort of more dominated by the character of Jesus, kind of rightly so. He would like it that way. So anyway, well, let's start as we kind of work through. So this week we're going to introduce kind of, if you like, the overarching picture of John, and then we're going to look at his the story of his birth. Actually his early years, and then next week we're going to start with him coming out of the wilderness, and the significance of what his baptism meant, the way in which it acted to prepare people, and then in the third week we will look at some of the later incidents that Jesus has regarding John, and setting up the place of his legacy, and looking at how John has not just prepared the way within Israel, but actually a bit like the story we were looking at when those of you who did the Spreading Flame story, John's ministry has actually had an impact across, particularly towards the east, as we're going to see. So we're going to look at that, and then of course there's the whole Pentecost fulfillment of the prophecies of Pentecost. So that will be week 3. So a man came sent from God, whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify about the light, so that everyone might believe through him. So straight away the Gospels are expecting that John's ministry is going to prepare people. He's preparing the way. But we often don't think too hard about actually how does he do that. So anyway, let's come back over here. Well, I've just realised I've disappeared. I need to turn myself back on. No, what have I just done? No, I didn't want that one. Turn that one off. It was, there we go. Okay. I'm going to go, this is where I thought I was. That's the text I just wrote, I read. Okay. In fact, I'm going to go, here, let's go like that. So, yeah, the program. So, yeah, this is what I was saying before. I knew I had a slide for it somewhere in here. There's the birth or the incarnation. Yeah, so get rid of me there. Trinity and Pentecost. So I can get in the way now. So I just want to start with that, unpacking a little bit that significance. Obviously, it's part of Jesus's testimony about John. So I've actually put them in the other order. The verse at the bottom is actually earlier, if you look. So the verse at the bottom is Matthew 9. Matthew 11 verse 9, the verse up on the top. I tell you, among those born of women, there has not arisen anyone greater than John the Baptist. So this is Jesus's testimony. And you know, I look at some of the Old Testament prophets, particularly Isaiah. Isaiah's the prophetic nuance in Isaiah is astounding. I didn't realize it for a long, long time. It's only as I've read more and more, and you start to realize how a book that's demonstrably happens centuries before the events he's talking about, how he touches on so many things that kind of make logical sense when you see the events unfolding. So people like Isaiah are incredible, but Jesus's testimony is there was something about John that saw it better. But we don't necessarily know it that well. So that's part of what we want to piece together is to understand his significance in the way he changed people's ways of thinking, what he saw, and how he responded to that in the moment. So yes, I tell you, much more than the prophet. That's Jesus answering the question, what did you go out to see? You went out to see, did you go out to see someone who's blown around like a reed in the wind? Nope, I tell you, he was more than a prophet. He was a prophet, yes, but more than a prophet. So John is really presented in many ways as being the pinnacle of prophethood in the sense of what was prophecy about before the Messiah comes. Because before Jesus comes, most prophecy is centered around his coming. And in Jesus' words, John hits or sits at the apex of that flow. As you get into the New Testament, prophecy is often about building up and encouraging people. So it's not prophecy anymore, but its focus is slightly shifted because Jesus has now come. So it's now about how to work those things out. So thinking about the significance, John, in the Bible, he is the only person other than Jesus whose miraculous birth is foretold both by the prophets and announced by an angel. So stop and think about that for a second. Samson, his birth is foretold by an angel. Just trying to think of someone whose birth is foretold. Well, obviously Isaac's birth is foretold, and it's miraculous, and so on. But you put all those bits together. There are miraculous births. There are births that are announced by angels, and there are births that are prophesied. Jesus captures all three of those, but so does John the Baptist. So that's a significant thing just to notice straight up. As I've already said, he's a witness of the incarnation, he's a revealer of the Trinity, and he's a prophet of Pentecost, which should make him very significant just in terms of the major themes that he, even in the handful of words we have explicitly captured, he captures all of those things. His influence is significant. I don't think I've got the slide in here. My apologies to folks like Barry who said how much they like seeing the early text. Coming to this, I had the possibility of creating so many slides, funny enough, that it would have taken kind of 15 episodes, and so I was juggling with what things to leave out. But for instance, Josephus tells us he was so popular that he could have raised an army. Which is and he actually says that's why Herod Antipas was so nervous of John. And so there is at a human level, there is a very real, it's not just a sense, it's probably at a practical level. John's message hit more people than Jesus, although it probably was less transformational, although it did ready them. So if I can put it that way, it seems, and this is not just an opinion, we'll try and see the numbers to some degree. that in a very short period of time, because John is, it may not be quite as tight as sometimes we read the Gospels, but it's still only a few years at the very maximum that John is prophesying. But within a few years, never having left the region or just outside of Jerusalem in the Jordan Valley where he's baptizing people, he impacts people that cover the entire old Greek Empire. His followers don't particularly push up into Europe, but all the way to the east, particularly to the east and down into the top of Egypt, you find that there are disciples of John the Baptist, as history shows them to us. The book of Acts refers to them, some in a follower of John who's from Alexandria, which is northern Europe and so on. But so he in a few years, his message captures the ideas and thoughts. And we'll think about how does that happen. They're not the depth and it's not the significance of what Jesus does, but in terms of just real numbers, it's enormous. Which is why the Gospels take it so much for granted that John's ministry was about preparing hearts. He got the masses ready. He, if you like, created the crowd that was ready to hear in the days before you had publicity to invite people to the meeting. That when Jesus came, the significant people who were going to be so massively transformed and do the longer term, deeper work were ready to hear. And there was something of that, of course, we capture it in that statement, he must increase, I must decrease. So Josephus, for instance, Josephus actually gives us more details about John the Baptist than he does Jesus, quite significantly more words. So as a Jewish writer, looking back, because he wasn't alive at the time of Jesus and John, he is aware that at a natural level, John seems to have had more impact than Jesus. What Jesus is doing is kind of is much more something that's seeping away at the foundations of humanity. And then will one day suddenly explode. But at the time when Josephus is looking back, just in terms of the numbers that have gone through what John was about and tried to ready their hearts, he sees John as more significant. The early church actually testified that John's followers are still around right the way up into the 2nd century. You find reference to them as part of the mission field. So a good century after John, the early church is testifying to John's disciples. More interestingly, well, I say more interestingly, but significantly, the Quran actually refers to John's followers as the third group of the book. It talks about Jews, it talks about Christians, and it talks about the Sabaeans, who are the followers of John. So they're named alongside those as all being people that are worthy of respect in the Quran, because they kind of worship the God of the book. So not only do John's disciples exist in the 7th century, which is the earliest that the Quran has started, you'll often be told it comes directly from the 7th century. If you're more aware of some of the more recent scholarship, you recognise it's actually kind of been developed up until about the 11th century, but we don't say that too loudly because you can get into a lot of trouble for saying it. But the point I'm really making here is that in the 7th century, they were significant enough over in the eastern part of the old Greek Empire, which is pushing along the old Silk Route, that there are enough communities of them that they are listed as a third group of people who follow the book. The Sabaeans actually still exist even today. They're now referred to as the Mandaeans. They go through a name change. They were kind of predominantly centered in Iran and Iraq, but the conflicts there mean that they've actually been spread out around the world. So there were about 60 or 70,000 of them about 10 years ago, living in the border of Iraq and Iran. It's not sure now whether they'll survive now they've been spread all over the world, but it's kind of, well, I think so anyway. You often will hear about other religious movements in Jesus's day, and people kind of talk as if they were just as significant, and why is it Jesus followers survived? Well, none of them actually did survive. Manichaeism is dead, Mithraism is dead, Sibylline worship is dead, Isis worship is dead. They were all around, but John actually had followers who still exist to today. Now today they are anti-Jesus, because they've kind of become more, as the years went on, they became more conscious of the fact that most of their numbers had now become Christians. And so I think I've oh yeah, so okay, I think I've got some text in a minute from the Mandean records, the Mandean scriptures, which kind of illustrates sort of where they went. But as I said, there they oh yeah, hang on. There we go. Yeah, so they when you actually look at the scriptures they're very influenced by the Gnostic tendencies, which were a Greek style of teaching that infected a number of religious systems. Of course, as we know, famously, it got into the Christian church as well. So it definitely got into the followers of John and kind of rooted there. And so part of their criticism of Jesus is the classic Gnostic criticism of Jesus, which Gnosticism denied, if you like, the flesh and saw it all as evil. And so they denied the truth of Jesus being resurrected in the flesh. It all becomes a spiritual, ethereal thing. So that's often where you find the critique of Jesus in John's followers today. One of the things we can say archaeologically is that they particularly seem to flow to the east. No, not to the east. Well, to the yes. Sorry. Precisely correctly. I was perfectly correct when I said it. If you imagine Israel drops down here, and most of the land mass is to the east. If you're going to come west, you're going to go into Europe or into Africa, and go south or north at the same time. They particularly spread out to the east. And interestingly, John's role within the Eastern Orthodox Church is far bigger than it is in the Catholic Church. And so that's probably a reflection of the kind of historic truth that, and you can understand as well how come John has so many followers in the East. When you think about where he does his baptizing, in the Jordan above the Dead Sea, and it's everyone who travels in as a pilgrimage from the old Eastern empires, where the Greeks pushed right up to the edge of China and down to the top of India and so on. So and they spread the Jewish population who they'd conquered all the way across the empire. So there are Jews in all parts of the empire of Greece, much more than there are in the empire of Rome. So the Romans coming from Europe, the Jews don't make it into Europe so much, but they were spread out in the old Alexandrian empire. And so all those Eastern Jews, as they came into Jerusalem, have to cross the Jordan. And there are only a couple of really significant kind of fording points where lots of people can cross at the same time. And these are the places that John uses for his ministry of baptism. So we'll think a little bit more about that again next week. But one of the things to flag is that John's baptism almost certainly doesn't take place the way we often envisage it or see it on our Jesus films, where he individually gets hold of each person, manhandles them under the water and up again. As we'll see although we don't have an exact text of the format of John's baptism, we can draw implications from the ideas of the way it theologically developed, a practice which is already there in Judaism, which much more is you have an officiator standing and people themselves pushing themselves under the water and getting up and then pronouncing blessings, which means, of course, you can do thousands of people at a time. And so as they were coming in, he was preaching, they were responding. In terms of response, he leads them into the waters that they have to ford to go to the feasts up in Jerusalem. They baptize themselves prophetically, symbolically in there. He then addresses them afterwards. We'll see this again next week, his little formula. And then they move on. And then they go back, you see. And so they go back to where they came from, and most of them came from the east. If they were coming from the south, doesn't mean to say they might not pop out of Jerusalem, but if you're coming from the south or from the north, you can come down and into Jerusalem, take part in the feast and go back without ever coming to where John is baptizing. So it's just for very practical reasons, it's not surprising to discover that his influence is far more in the east than it was in the west. So for instance, as I've got there on the slide, John gets 6 feast days in Eastern Christianity, i.e. the Eastern Orthodox Church, where he gets 2 in Catholicism. So he's kind of 3 times as popular, if you want to think of it like that. I mentioned the Mandean book of John, which criticises Jesus. You can see it's written much later, because it talks about practices in the church which are Roman Catholic developments, and obviously, but I'll show it to you because people are interested in seeing these kind of things. So the Book of John does have some stuff that some scholars reckon goes back to about the 2nd century, and they are the much more Gnostic parts. This part is particularly thought to be written probably more like 800. And the reason we can say that is because it refers to things like using the term Eucharist, as you can see in the text. And there's a crozier, and these are all much later developments, so they're not old. But they give you that sense of how the followers of John have tried to hold on to what John gave them without accepting Christ. Most of the followers have accepted Jesus, but those that don't, who are collecting these scriptures together. So the Jordan is in which Christ is baptized. So they recognize that, they see then that because Christ is baptized by John, he was less than John. I've made them into that little blank. I'm not sure whether it was damage or whether it's a word that they can't translate. I've turned it into a font. So in other words, what they're saying is we're looking at what goes on. We don't like what the Christians do because now we see the Romans baptizing babies in a font, whereas actually when John baptized Christ, he put him in the river. See, so that's much better. The morsel which Christ takes, I've made into the Eucharist. The spring water which Christ takes, I've made into something of the Eucharist. So in the bread and the wine, they're saying that the things that Jesus was doing have become this trivial sort of little symbol, whereas we do it on the big scale. Not sure what the reference to the turban is. I've made into a blank of the priesthood. The staff which Christ takes, I've made into something of the crozier. But what you can see is they're commenting around 800, and they're looking in at the way Christianity is developing, particularly in the Roman Empire, and kind of saying we've got something better because we've held on to something much more tangible, much more in line with the way John baptized Jesus. So Jesus and the Western Roman Church are being accused of idolatry and having small gods. So words straight after ones I've just put there goes on and says, "Beware for me of the Romans who are like offshoots of the cross that they fix on the walls, and they begin to worship the crucifix. Beware for me, my brothers, the God framed by a carpenter. If a carpenter framed of God, then who framed the carpenter?" So what they're sort of saying is somehow this religion that Christ came to produce, we look at it, we don't see it as good as what we've got. Jesus was a carpenter. He died on a cross. He's turned that that carpenter's symbol or whatever into something, and now it's being worshipped as if it's God. So you hear what I'm saying is I don't want you to hear me disrespecting the cross or anything like that. I'm trying to get that sense. But the fact that we can get these things is often a shock. The fact that we have these records of what the followers of John, not what John taught. It's not dissimilar, for instance, to people like Confucius. What Confucius actually thought is not what the Confucians believe and worship now. But the fact that they're still there kind of shows you the significance that he had in people's public imagination, because they hit thousands upon thousands upon thousands of them have responded prophetically by immersing themselves into the waters of the Jordan in the hope of something of the kingdom coming, which we're going to look at next week. And so as a result, they've remembered it and they've talked about it and they've gone back with it, and it's got real history to it. It's got real legs to it. It lasts a long, long time. So as I've touched on that, it seems that John's message actually creates disciples that have got spread through all of that old Greek Empire, which actually does go from Egypt up to India, to Central Asia. But it doesn't really push into Rome, as you can notice. It doesn't push into Europe or North, where we were talking at the beginning about Andrew, who takes the gospel up there as well. But it is a part, I think, of the preparation work, not just for the message that Jesus brings in Judea and Jerusalem, but even of his message as it goes out, because we read about in the book of Acts how Paul goes to the Jews first and then to the Greeks. And in doing so, occasionally they meet a group of disciples of John the Baptist, you see. So it's you can see that preparation work that is being laid in his ministry. the little graphic I put here is a kind of a typical, as what in the Eastern Orthodox Church they refer to as the Adesis icon. And just to kind of understand the perspective, therefore, of the Eastern Church, which was so much more influenced by John the Baptist, perhaps, than the Roman Church, which has become the contrast, you will normally see in its kind of iconography that where in the Western Church you will see Jesus either surrounded by the four evangelists who wrote the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, or by the 12 disciples who carry the message out. In the Roman Church, Jesus is almost always flanked by Mary on one side and John on the other. And the understanding is these are the characters that brought Christ into the world. Obviously, Mary by submitting and allowing Jesus to be born through her, and John who came and produced the moment that actually made history kind of ready for Jesus to step into. And they're used at a kind of in a worship level to meditate on, so that Christ is formed in us, you see. So again, you're seeing this big significance in the big wing of the church, which unfortunately, because of the schisms that eventually happened between East and Western Christianity, we've lost a lot of that history. So let's keep going. So so as the sort of the forerunner, as we think of him, outside of the crucifixion, if you look at the four Gospels, there are only a handful of events, which I've listed down here, that are recorded in all four Gospels. So, for instance, to give you examples, the first one is John the Baptist. So, saying he's significant because he's one of only a handful of things that make it into all four Gospels. All four Gospels tell us about Jesus coming into Galilee, starting to itinerate around Galilee. All four Gospels tell us about the feeding of the 5,000. Something that often people miss is all four Gospels also tell us that Jesus relocates to Judea for the last year of his ministry. And then all four beyond the Jordan. Oh yeah, so all four Gospels refer to events in the Easter week beyond the Jordan, i.e. I can't remember why it says beyond the Jordan. Put it in those ways. Okay, and of course all 4 weeks cover the gospel narrative. So all four Gospels see this event, and you can see with the moves and the 5,000. These are significant events that whether it's the synoptic version, Matthew, Mark and Luke, or whether it's John's Gospel, we need these to anchor the story of Jesus. So actually, if you stop and think about it in the big scale way, John the Baptist comes, Jesus was baptized by John, John released him, John prepared him. Jesus started by itinerating around in Galilee. Then there was a significant feeding of the 5,000. Then he moved to the south, to Judea. Then just in the last week, he moved slightly east. And then, of course, there's the crucifixion week itself. So in that sense, as you look at it, John plays a significant role as well, because there aren't many things that get referred to in all four Gospels. Outside of actually I should have done a slide on this, the people who appear in all four Gospels. So apart from Mary Magdalene, Mary the mother of Jesus, probably, nope, Joseph doesn't make it into John, I don't think. John is there, so he's very significant.